Imagine a man so cruel, even his nickname, the Butcher of Rostov, sends chills down your spine. Andrei Chikatilo is that man. His reign of terror spanned over a decade. He was responsible for the brutal murders of at least 52 people. His crimes were so horrifying that they left an indelible mark on Russian criminal history. Chikatilo's methods were beyond gruesome. He assaulted, mutilated, and cannibalized his victims. The brutality he exhibited is rarely seen in modern criminal history. His victims ranged from young children to adults. The randomness of his targets made him even more terrifying. No one was safe in his presence. But how did Chikatilo become this monster? What drove him to commit such heinous acts? To understand this, we need to delve into his early life. Early experiences often shape a person's psyche. Unfortunately, Chikatilo's formative years were nothing short of a nightmare. Born in 1936 in Ukraine, Andrei Chikatilo's childhood was marred by hardship. His family lived through the famine of the early 1930s. Starvation was a constant companion. Chikatilo's mother often recounted a gruesome tale. She claimed that Chikatilo's older brother had been kidnapped and cannibalized. Whether true or not, this story haunted young Andrei. Growing up, Chikatilo was a shy and introverted child. He was often bullied at school. His physical appearance made him an easy target. He had a speech impediment, which only made things worse. The constant humiliation and isolation took a toll on his mental health. Chikatilo's early experiences with violence and deprivation should not be underestimated. His dysfunctional family environment contributed to his psychological issues. His father was captured during World War II, adding to the family's woes. Chikatilo's mother was abusive, further compounding his misery. These early traumas laid the groundwork for his future crimes. They fueled his perverse desires and violent tendencies. But the full horror of Chikatilo's actions would not come to light until years later. His dark path was just beginning. Chikatilo's disturbing behavior began to surface in adulthood. In the 1960s, he moved to Rostov-on-Don. He married and had 2 children. On the surface, he appeared to be living a normal life. However, beneath this facade, a sinister transformation was taking place. In 1978, Chikatilo committed his first known murder. His victim was a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakotnova. He lured her to a secluded area and attacked her. The sheer brutality of the act was shocking. This crime marked the beginning of a horrifying killing spree. He would often approach his victims in public places. He appeared friendly and harmless, which made it easier to gain their trust. Once isolated, he would unleash his pent-up rage. His ability to blend in with society made him a dangerous predator. Chikatilo had an uncanny ability to lure his victims. He preyed on the vulnerable, the young, and the unsuspecting. His charm was his primary weapon. He would often approach children, offering them candy or toys. With adults, he posed as a helpful stranger or an employer offering work. Once he gained their trust, he would lead them to isolated locations. These places were carefully chosen. They provided the seclusion he needed to carry out his horrific acts. Forests, abandoned buildings, and remote paths became his hunting grounds. The victims had little chance to escape once they were in his grasp. Chikatilo's attacks were marked by extreme violence. He often used a knife, stabbing his victims repeatedly. The rage he exhibited was almost animalistic. This overkill was a manifestation of his deep-seated frustrations. He derived a perverse satisfaction from inflicting pain. His methods evolved, but his cruelty remained consistent. Some victims were strangled, others were mutilated post-mortem. This unpredictability made it difficult for law enforcement to identify patterns. Chikatilo's ability to adapt kept him one step ahead of the authorities for years. Section 5. The Horrifying Acts. Details of the murders. Each murder carried the same horrifying signature. Chikatilo's attacks were frenzied and brutal. His victims suffered immensely. The sheer brutality of his actions left investigators baffled. They were dealing with a killer whose violence knew no bounds. He often targeted young girls and boys. They were easier to manipulate and overpower. His attacks would start with sexual assault, followed by extreme violence. Stabbing was his preferred method. He inflicted dozens of wounds on his victims, often focusing on the eyes. Post-mortem mutilation was a common element. Chikatilo would often disembowel his victims. He sometimes removed body parts and took them as trophies. This behavior indicated a deep-seated psychological disturbance. It wasn't just about killing, it was about domination and control. The randomness of his attacks added to the horror. He killed in different locations, making it hard to predict his next move. This unpredictability terrorized the community. People were living in constant fear, not knowing when Chikatilo would strike next. Section 6. The Elusive Shadow. Evading Capture. Chikatilo's ability to evade capture was remarkable. His unassuming appearance played a significant role. He did not fit the typical profile of a serial killer. This made it easier for him to blend in with the crowd. His job as a supply clerk required travel, providing him with opportunities to kill. The Soviet police were initially ill-equipped to handle such a case. They lacked the experience and resources needed for a serial killer investigation. The political climate hindered the investigation. Authorities were reluctant to admit such a criminal could exist in their society. Chikatilo's meticulous nature also contributed to his evasion. He was careful to leave no evidence behind. He often wore gloves and disposed of his victims' belongings. His knowledge of police procedures allowed him to stay ahead. He even managed to pass several polygraph tests. Despite multiple arrests, Chikatilo was released due to lack of evidence. This emboldened him, and he continued his spree. The authorities were growing increasingly desperate. The pressure to catch the Rostov Ripper was mounting. Yet, Chikatilo remained elusive, like a shadow in the night. Section 7. The Arrest. The Fall of Chikatilo. The tide finally turned in 1990. A breakthrough came when a detective noticed Chikatilo acting suspiciously at a train station. He was detained, and his behavior during interrogation raised red flags. Unlike previous encounters, this time the police had more experience and better techniques at their disposal. Chikatilo initially denied any involvement in the murders. However, forensic evidence was starting to pile up. Blood and semen samples linked him to several crime scenes. The authorities finally had the concrete evidence they needed to build a case against him. The web of lies he had spun was beginning to unravel. Under intense interrogation, Chikatilo eventually confessed. His admissions were chilling. He described his crimes in graphic detail, showing no remorse. His confessions provided the investigators with a horrifying glimpse into his mind. It was clear that they were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual. The arrest brought a sense of relief to the terror-stricken community. The butcher of Rostov was finally behind bars. However, the journey to justice was far from over. Chikatilo's trial would become a media spectacle, captivating the entire nation. Section 8. The Trial, Public Outrage, and Legal Battles. Chikatilo's trial began in April 1992. It was one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Russian history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers. The public's fascination with the case was palpable. This was not just a trial, it was a public catharsis. Chikatilo's behavior during the trial was erratic. At times, he appeared calm and composed. Other times, he erupted in fits of rage, shouting obscenities. His bizarre antics only added to the media frenzy. It was evident that he relished the attention, feeding off the public's horror. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. Forensic reports, witness testimonies, and Chikatilo's own confessions painted a damning picture. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Chikatilo was insane. They claimed that he was not responsible for his actions due to his mental state. The trial lasted for several months. It was a grueling process that took a toll on everyone involved. The testimonies were heart-wrenching, detailing the unimaginable suffering of the victims. The public's outrage grew with each passing day. They demanded justice for the lives lost. Section 9. The Conviction, Justice Served. In October 1992, the verdict was finally delivered. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 counts of murder. The judge condemned him in no uncertain terms, calling him a beast in human form. Chikatilo was sentenced to death, a punishment befitting his monstrous crimes. The conviction brought a sense of closure to the victims' families. They had waited years for this moment. The relief was palpable, but so was the sorrow. No sentence could bring back their loved ones. However, knowing that Chikatilo would never harm anyone again was a small comfort. Chikatilo was sent to death row. He spent the next 2 years in solitary confinement. During this time, he showed no signs of remorse. He remained unrepentant to the end, clinging to his twisted justifications. His demeanor was a stark reminder of the evil that lurked within him. In February 1994, Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in Russian history. The butcher of Rostov was no more. Justice had been served, but the scars he left behind would never fully heal. Section 10. The Lasting Impact. Chikatilo's Dark Legacy. The legacy of Andrei Chikatilo is a grim one. His crimes have become a dark chapter in the annals of criminal history. He remains one of the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century. His actions have left a lasting impact on both the public and the criminal justice system. Chikatilo's case prompted significant changes in investigative procedures. The Soviet police were criticized for their initial handling of the case. This led to reforms aimed at improving law enforcement capabilities. The need for better forensic techniques and psychological profiling became evident. The public's fascination with Chikatilo's crimes has not waned. Books, documentaries, and films have been produced, attempting to understand the mind of a monster. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk within seemingly ordinary individuals. The victims of Chikatilo's rampage are not forgotten. Memorials and tributes have been erected in their honor. Their stories serve as a sobering reminder of the human cost of unchecked evil. The butcher of Rostov may be gone, but the memories of his victims live on.